One of the most influential voices in media used to be found on TV or radio or in the pages of a newspaper. But there's a voice today who's heard above all but a few, and it's through a podcast. Joe Rogan has an estimated 11 million listeners, and the influence of his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, goes even beyond his audience. His shows have fostered public debate on COVID policies, affected prices on the stock market, and at a time when the public is suspicious of mass media, Rogan's straightforward approach and willingness to listen to all sides has made him one of the most notable and trusted voices out there. So, how did the stand-up comedian, sitcom actor, and game show host become so powerful? Who is Joe Rogan?
Joe Rogan is like a heat-seeking missile. He's tenacious, he's fiercely independent, and he's intellectually inquisitive.
He was born in Newark, New Jersey, 1967, and spent some time there. He eventually moved to Florida, San Francisco, and then to Massachusetts.
Joe Rogan says because he moved around so much, he didn't have the ability to create long-term friendships. And so he turned all his attention inwards to find out what his curiosity was and what his natural interests were.
In addition to the many moves, Rogan also had a tumultuous relationship with his father.
His father was extremely violent. He remembers his father beating up his mother. Although Joe Rogan doesn't have a lot of memories of his childhood, he does remember this one event distinctly when he was 5 years old. He got into a fight with his cousin. He punched his cousin in the face. Joe Rogan's dad comes into the room and says, "What happened?" Joe Rogan explains that he punched his cousin in the face, and his dad said, "But did you cry?" Joe Rogan says, "I didn't cry." He said, "Good, as long as you don't cry." From that moment, he felt his father gave him the green light to beat up everybody. His dad wanted Joe Rogan to be like him, and Joe Rogan did not want to.
At the age of 13, Rogan did find a physical outlet which helped shape the rest of his life.
He's been doing martial arts forever, since he was a teenager, and he's always been very fit, very active.
He says ever since he was a child, he was impulsive, he was reckless, he was feral. And that martial arts gave him the opportunity to channel this into a sport and something that was productive.
He likes risk-taking, and he feels it's a way to better yourself.
He said that everyone had told him not to do martial arts, but he was really pulled towards it. And he felt like a loser, and martial arts was the first time in his life where he actually felt like a winner. He said after he did martial arts, he learned two main lessons. One lesson is that hard work pays off and you can be a winner. And the second lesson that he learned was to never listen to anybody.
Well, maybe not anybody. Rogan got his first taste of stand-up comedy in high school.
At the age of 15, Joe Rogan went to see Richard Pryor, and he saw the roaring laughter in the audience. And he said that that moment planted a seed in his head that he wanted to explore that art form.
After dropping out of college, he was all in.
He went to University of Massachusetts, Boston, spent 3 years there, didn't graduate.
At the same time, he continued to do martial arts, and he realized some of his friends in the martial arts world were slurring their speech. Joe Rogan was so afraid of becoming brain damaged that he knew at that moment that he had to find an alternate career path. At the age of 21, his friend invited him to do open mic, and that's where his comedy career began.
He sees comedy as another muscle to be trained. I think he's a very smart fellow. I think he's no genius, but I think he's always been curious. I think he's always been intrigued by possibilities. I think he's always yearning to get smarter, to grow, to expand his knowledge.
He won't betray himself by stifling his own intellectual curiosity. His ethos is to remain true to himself.
In 1997, 2 years into the news radio run, Rogan began to branch out. This time, he combined his love for martial arts with his entertainment skills when he became a post-fight interviewer for what was then a niche sport, ultimate fighting.
The sport wasn't as big, as powerful as it is right now, so either he sensed it had great room for growth or he just loved it. I suspect the latter.
The UFC is a perfect fit for Joe. He said that he felt like a loser till he started winning in martial arts. He has such a deep emotional connection with martial arts, and his passion comes through to his audience.
He's been fighting since he was a teenager. He loves the sport. He knows the sport inside and out. He's able to kind of, break down the punches, the kicks, the battles, the strategy involved. And so I think he has gravitated into areas that interest him.
His audience says that watching UFC without Joe's commentary is like Christmas without snow. What works in this role is that he's so deeply passionate and committed to martial arts, and he's deeply entrenched in everything that's happening in front of him.
By 1999, Rogan's career had taken off. He had news radio, the UFC, and a 3-record comedy deal with Warner Brothers. Then tragedy struck.
Actor and comedian Phil Hartman was found dead of a gunshot wound in a house in Encino. There was another body in the house.
Unfortunately, after Phil Hartman was murdered, the show was canceled. The loss of his friendship with Phil Hartman was a devastating blow to Joe Rogan, and it took a while for him to grieve and to process and to bounce back.
He was very tight with Phil Hartman. He canceled some of his comedy shows, and he said at the time that it really changed his outlook on fame and fortune. And I think if you look forward in his career, some of the choices that Joe Rogan has made maybe reflect that, where he wasn't searching for fame. So I think that really did play a role in his evolution. And obviously not intentional, it was a tragedy, but I think that helped shape who he is today, really.
In 2006, Fear Factor ended its 6-season run, but Rogan still had comedy albums, the main commentator gig on the increasingly popular UFC broadcasts, and a sold-out nationwide stand-up tour. He didn't need controversy, but made the comedy world squirm by confronting on stage a popular comic for lifting material from other performers.
Motherfuckers steal and make it on HBO. They steal they put it on television.
He accuses Carlos Mencia of stealing all these other comedians' jokes, and he calls him Carlos Mencia.
It was caught on video, it was on YouTube.
I've seen you do all Richard Pryor.
It was a sensation for sure. I think it showed that Joe Rogan will stand up for not only his comedy, but other people's material as well.
Rogan was essentially taking a risk because Mencia, while he wasn't respected amongst comics, he was essentially respected among the audience and among the industry. So Rogan was taking a chance.
Carlos attacks Joe Rogan and attacks his character and says, "What is it to you?" because he never stole Joe Rogan's jokes. And Joe decided to vociferously defend all the other comedians whose jokes had been stolen. The comedians love this because who doesn't like someone standing up for them when they're too afraid to stand up for themselves? Because of this event, Joe was banned from the Comedy Store from 2007 to 2013.
Despite the ban, Rogan continued to thrive. And then, in 2009, Rogan launched the Joe Rogan Experience, a podcast.
When you look at what Joe Rogan has done as a podcaster, it seems a little bit too simple, too basic.
New York Times just now is admitting that the Hunter Biden laptop is real.
Okay, so you have a comedian, he's in his studio, he invites a guest in, and they talk and talk and talk. But there's no filters here.
Some f***ery is afoot.
His podcast is so unique because he does not promote a single ideology. Joe Rogan believes in presenting all different views, opposing views, dissenting views, and having the audience have an opportunity to make their own informed decision.
I remember when his show first started getting attention, and people were like, who is this guy? What's his fan base? And it's kind of hard to figure out.
A lot of his fans are people who followed his career as a comedian, and also people who followed him in UFC.
I think his appeal, the appeal of his podcast, it stems from his looseness in his stand-up days. He knows how to relate to people.
Whether it was Rogan, the guests, or the format, the Joe Rogan Experience took off. And by 2015, had millions of subscribers.
Over time, it struck a nerve, and I think once he got more popular, he was able to bring in voices that you never hear on the podcast. It could be a politician with extreme views. It could be something as radical as Alex Jones of InfoWars fame. You may hate Alex Jones, but to hear him talk without a filter in a conversation, you know that Joe Rogan's going to dig deeper into his life than most other interviewers.
Joe Rogan's podcast guests are like Baskin Robbins. There's every flavor. His interview with Edward Snowden has had over 35 million views on YouTube. He's also had Bernie Sanders. He has a whole host of people from different backgrounds come on his show to share their ideas, views, and truth.
He just does what interests him. Now, why does that interest so many people? It's because there's so many facets of his personality that kind of converge with a lot of what's going on in our culture today. He loves risk-taking. There's comedy. People love to laugh. That has a huge audience. So it's all of these worlds that are combining, and that's why he has such a big audience. Now, a lot of other people in the culture say, hey, why is this so big? And then other famous people and CEOs, they want to be a part of it.
Success also breeds influence. As Rogan's audience grew, he was able to book bigger guests. A prime example of this was his interview with Elon Musk.
When a Joe Rogan interviews an Elon Musk, there are consequences. It depends on what he says, it depends on the questions, it depends on the tone.
I mean, it's legal, right?
It's totally legal.
Okay.
And it depends on whether the Tesla CEO smokes pot with Rogan on air.
There's tobacco and marijuana in there.
When Musk did that in September 2018, the company's stock price plummeted.
Now he's in a heap of trouble over what he said in that interview.
We're looking at a 2018 low now for the stock. At one point, it was down 10%, worst intraday loss in 2 years for Tesla.
This incident was one of the earliest indications that Rogan's podcast was reaching beyond his audience and into the mainstream.
I think what made Rogan have staying power was that old adage, nothing succeeds like success. So there's a podcast that, by all accounts, shouldn't work. Dudes talking for 3 hours sounds boring. Why is it such a hit? I think I'll tune in. Then people tune in. It gets even bigger. And then, because of the fact that he doesn't censor himself, he's bound to cause controversy. So he gets in the headlines. More people tune in.
Joe says one of the things that freaks people out about him is that he talks wild. By that, I think he means that he challenges the status quo. He challenges mainstream opinions.
What he has is the trust of the people, more or less. And the reason he has that is because he seems to be a straight shooter. He seems to have no specific agenda. He gets roughly 11 million listeners per episode. Well, when you think about a sitcom on TV, that's more than that. You think about The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, it's much more than that by 4 or 5 times. So this is a massive audience, an audience that has a lot of trust in its host, an audience that has a connection, because podcasting, like radio, there's a bit of intimacy built into the process where you feel like you know them.
Joe Rogan has established himself as a popular figure who can change the social landscape. In May of 2020, that all paid off when he signed a massive contract with Spotify to broadcast exclusively through them.
The Wall Street Journal reported that Joe Rogan had signed a deal with Spotify for $100 million. Subsequently, the New York Times reported that that number is closer to $200 million for all the rights to his podcast till 2023.
It shows you that podcasting really has hit a moment, that this is not a flash in the pan.
Rogan had the knack for being in the right place at the right time. His comedy career started during the stand-up comedy boom of the 80s. He got involved with the UFC when hardly anyone knew what it was. And he started a podcast in the genre's infancy. It happened again after Rogan signed his deal in May of 2020 as COVID was spreading across America.
In the beginning of the pandemic, Joe Rogan had a variety of guests on his shows. Some were pro-vax, some were anti-vax. The people who were anti-vax were presenting views that were very different from the mainstream media.
I think that the media distrust kind of ballooned during the COVID years. And I think that when he came along and said, you know, I don't necessarily believe X, Y, and Z, or maybe you should question what they're saying.
He was having some pretty interesting people on talking about COVID, talking about vaccines. And early on, he said things like, I'm not gonna wear a mask. I'm not gonna cover my face.
There were 2 specific guests, Peter McCullough and Robert Malone, that Joe Rogan brought onto his show. He felt that they were presenting diverse opinions, but because these opinions were so different from the opinions of mainstream media, he was accused of spreading dangerous COVID misinformation.
He also was a comedian, not a journalist, and he was talking about things. He was interviewing people that were outside the mainstream.
He wasn't making any kind of declarative statements or articulating any policy that he thought people should follow. Why? Because that's not what he does on his show. He sits around and he talks. And that's what he was doing. And you know what? That's what the rest of America was doing too. It's just they didn't have a microphone in front of their face.
I'm interested in having interesting conversations with people that have differing opinions.
Joe Rogan says he's not a doctor, he's not a virologist, and that's why he's bringing all these different people onto his podcast so he can learn ideas from them and to learn how they arrive to the conclusions they arrive to.
Some of my ideas are not that prepared or fleshed out because I'm literally having them in real time.
He would say things like, you know what? Do I really need a vaccine? Do healthy people need a vaccine? People started freaking out.
They're just conversations, and I think that's also the appeal of the show.
The fallout from this event was that 200 scientists, physicians, and healthcare workers wrote an open letter to Spotify wanting to correct the dangerous spread of misinformation.
I'm not trying to promote misinformation. I'm not trying to be controversial. I've never tried to do anything with this podcast other than just talk to people.
Why couldn't we say those things? Why couldn't we question these narratives? And that's what Rogan plugged into, and that's why he became really controversial.
He's like, look, I'm healthy. I'm Joe Rogan. I can beat this thing. I don't mind. I'll get COVID.
Rogan got COVID.
And turns out I got COVID.
He went very public with it. He put out an Instagram video basically saying, I'm not feeling well. And here are the medications I took to try to feel better. And it was a kitchen sink approach, but one of them was ivermectin, which was a really controversial issue because we didn't know if it would be effective with COVID. He tried it based on his doctor's permission, and the media went crazy.
He has a pretty big platform, and that's really destructive. He has a responsibility to tell people the truth and to help people.
A lot of people tried to have him canceled. The tech companies, they pulled some of his episodes off. YouTube took him off their channel because he was, they said, dealing in misinformation.
It really showed Rogan, my gosh, I don't know if I can trust the mainstream media. I don't know if what they're saying is accurate. And again, it reflected with a lot of people.
Artists like Neil Young and Joni Mitchell removed their music from Spotify because Spotify would not remove Joe Rogan.
Daniel Ek, as the CEO of Spotify, stood by him. You can point to a lot of different factors. One, Rogan is very successful, has an amazing connection with his fans. That's vital. You've got the biggest star in podcasting. Do you really want to cut ties with him at this point?
And luckily, Spotify made the right decision because they realized, look, we're a big tech company, but in the end, we're not making Joe Rogan. He's making us. We're riding his coattails. So why don't we let him do his thing?
What's really interesting is he gained 2 million followers during this time.
Rogan survived the media outrage from his COVID episodes. But in February of 2022, he was once again involved in controversy.
He recently got involved in some controversy over past statements where he said some racially insensitive things. So what did he do? He said, yeah, I said them. I'm embarrassed. I don't like what I said.
It's not my word to use. I'm well aware of that now. I never use it to be racist because I'm not racist. But whenever you're in a situation where you have to say, I'm not racist, you f***ed up. And I clearly have f***ed up.
I think that his use of the N-word was deplorable. There's no excuse for it, and I'm glad he apologized.
Maybe Rogan had just grown too big to cancel. In the end, Spotify removed just 20 of the 1,000+ Joe Rogan Experience shows and took no other action against him.
Cancel culture is really hard to predict because it changes, it morphs, it gets worse, it gets better, it gets more severe. Things that were totally acceptable 5 years ago are suddenly you can't go near that conversation. So for a podcaster like Rogan, you never know what the future holds.
It's difficult to cancel Joe Rogan because people want to hear uncensored information. We live in America. People want to hear the truth. People want to hear both sides. And Joe Rogan creates an opportunity and a platform for people to hear both sides.
Because he is apolitical, because he doesn't belong to a single side, is able to avoid a lot of those skirmishes.
He calls himself a hybrid. He says he believes in ideas from both parties. For example, he believes in gay rights, he believes in women's rights, he believes in civil rights. As well, he believes in the Second Amendment and gun rights.
Rogan doesn't seem to be going anywhere in the near future.
He is now a shaper of the culture. People can't stop talking about Joe Rogan, and I don't think he intended that when he started the podcast. He just knew, if I hang out with my bros and we just talk, I know there's going to be an audience for it. I don't know how big it's going to be, but I don't really care.
Because of the way the culture is today, with so many people who are afraid to say certain things, with so many people willing to apologize, willing to kind of accept certain narratives, given all that, it elevates Joe Rogan. It makes him more powerful, more influential than he could have ever imagined.
So who is Joe Rogan? On one level, a TV personality who has achieved startling influence in a divided country. How did he do it? Maybe it just takes a court jester to speak truth to the kingdom. If that's a secret, don't expect Joe Rogan to go away anytime soon.